Welcome everyone to the first event this term. This is an event co-hosted by the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series, the Belonging, Identity, Language and Diversity Research Group, as well as DISE Research Talks. So thank you all for coming. Today we're very happy to have Dr. Vijay Ramjattan, yeah. From the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Dr. Vijay Ramjattan today will talk about his PhD research, which examined an important and timely topic in second language education. Hi, welcome everyone. So he's going to talk about the racialization as well as the professionalization of accent with regards to the experiences of international teaching assistants. His research lies at the intersection of language, race, and work. Part of his current thinking involves trying to incorporate anti-racist perspectives in workplace language learning. So today, Dr. Ramjattan will have about an hour for his talk, which will be followed by a 30-minute discussion period. The hour talk today will be video recorded, but the discussion afterwards won't be, so that you feel comfortable, participate, and share in the discussion period. The video recording will be available on the Plurilingual YouTube channel afterwards. Not immediately after, but a couple of years later. And also, Adela today will be taking pictures, so if ever you're not comfortable with us posting the pictures, just feel free to let her know so that she won't post them for you. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much, Alexa, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming today. So I was walking, I didn't know McGill had so many hills, so I'm sort of exhausted. So hopefully I have enough energy to say something coherent today for all of you. So yeah, I have to say a special thank you to Angelica for inviting me. Thank you to the Plurilingual Lab and DISE and the Faculty of Ed here at McGill, the BILD research group. So thank you to everyone who sort of did all the behind the scenes work to have me here today. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, so the title of my talk today is Raciolinguistic Ideologies at Work. And as you can tell, I italicized the last two words, at work. So I did that for a reason. Basically, the reason why I wanted to italicize those last two words is because today I'm talking about raciolinguistic ideologies at work. So I'll spend a lot of time talking about raciolinguistic ideologies in a few minutes. But basically, when I talk about at work, I'm using it as a synonym for in the workplace, right? So basically, I'm talking about raciolinguistic ideologies in the workplace. But also, at work can also mean in action. So I'm not just interested in talking about raciolinguistic ideologies just randomly occurring in the workplace. I'm also interested in showing you how they're actually active forces in the labor market and also in the actual doing of the labor, so the labor process. Okay. So having said that, the main proposition of my talk today is the following. Given the ubiquity of language in many types of work, raciolinguistic ideologies often determine the identities of ideal and non-ideal workers, as well as the parameters of doing work. Okay. But before I go into this argument, I actually just want to give you a brief overview of my presentation today. So I'll spend a lot of time talking about what are exactly raciolinguistic ideologies. Then I'll sort of transition to a general discussion of language and work in late capitalism and try to connect that back to the discussion of raciolinguistic ideologies. Then the main part of my presentation will be looking at raciolinguistic ideologies in the labor market. And to do so, I'll sort of draw on my past research with racialized English language teachers in Toronto. So yeah, English language teaching, ELT. The second main part of my presentation is looking at raciolinguistic ideologies in the labor market. And then to do so, I'll draw on my most recent PhD work with international teaching assistants, or ITs for short. The final part is my superficial attempt of how we can sort of further explore racial-linguistic ideologies in the workplace, and of course how we can try to dismantle them at the same time. Okay, so let's start off by answering the question, what are racial-linguistic ideologies? So just to clarify, this is not a term that I invented, right? We have to give the credit to Nelson Flores at the University of Pennsylvania and Jonathan Rosa at Stanford University. So they are the godfathers of racial-linguistic ideology, so we have to praise them for coming up with this powerful conceptual vocabulary for us. So even though they've written extensively about racial-linguistic ideologies in numerous publications, today I'm just drawing on two particular ones. So these two sources are highly cited, and they also sort of give us a general idea of the origins of racial-linguistic ideologies. So the first one is Undoing Appropriateness, Racial-Linguistic Ideologies and Language Diversity in Education, and that's a 2015 Harvard Educational Review article. The second one is Unsettling Race and Language, Toward a Racial-Linguistic Perspective, and that's a 2017 Language and Society article. So since I'm going to be giving you a fairly superficial overview of racial-linguistic ideologies, I really encourage you to look at these two sources in particular to get a sense of the history of how Flores and Rosa came to conceptualize this term, what types of literature they draw on, how they apply racial-linguistic ideologies to their own research areas, right? So they provide much more nuance and explanation than what I can give you today, unfortunately. Having said that, however, I'm going to try to give you a fairly concrete sense of racial-linguistic ideologies because, well, I need you to understand that for you to understand the rest of my presentation today. So the first thing to remember is that in defining racial-linguistic ideologies, Flores and Rosa actually make a powerful statement about the nature of research concerning language and race. So for them, instead of focusing on how racialized people actually speak or how they actually produce language, we really need to pay attention to how we hear racialized people or how we perceive their language practices in general. So with that said, Flores and Rosa sort of define racial-linguistic ideologies as, quote, producing racialized speaking subjects who are constructed as linguistically deviant, even when engaging in linguistic practices positioned as normative or innovative when produced by privileged white subjects. So it's basically this idea that even if racialized people speak identically to privileged white people, their racial positioning in society is going to prevent them from being perceived as using language proficiently or in an expert manner, right? They're always going to be perceived as deficient language users. So another way to kind of think about racial-linguistic ideologies is to think of them as constructing a so-called white listening subject, right? Who hears the linguistic deficiency of racialized groups despite evidence showing otherwise. So basically, once again, even if racialized people are using language in an expert manner and in a manner that's similar to white people, right, the white listening subject is going to hear them as deficient language users. So when we talk about racial-linguistic ideologies, this notion of the white listening subject is actually quite important. It's a central term in racial-linguistic ideologies. And so there's several points that we have to take note of when we talk about the white listening subject. So the first thing to remember is that it's not actually an actual white person. So anyone can be a white listening subject. So yeah, that's kind of racist progress in a way, if you want to think about it like that. So this actually leads to the second point. It's actually an ideological position or manner of perception, right? So a person of color, a white person, anyone can really adopt this subject position in their everyday lives and in their everyday roles, etc. The white listening subject is also just one component of what Rosa and Flores would call a white perceiving subject. So the white listening subject is really thinking about the auditory realm of racialized language practices, but the white perceiving subject can be found in how we interpret the writing practices of racialized people. So we might have a white reading subject, for example. Even extra linguistic factors like maybe clothing and hairstyles, right? So maybe the clothing or hairstyles of racialized people are going to be perceived as deficient when compared to those of white people. So when I talk about the white listening subject, oftentimes I'm just referring to the white perceiving subject. So just please forgive my inaccuracy in advance. So, yeah.
Could you just give an example to make it a little bit clearer? So
Of the white perceiving?
Of a non-white person engaging in white listening, just so I can...
Okay. If in a few more slides, I'll give you it. Sorry. No, but thank you for that. So the final thing to remember about the white listening subject is that it's also enacted by non-human actors, such as technologies. It's embedded in policies. It's manifested in organizational cultures, etc. So it's basically this idea that the white listening subject is not just located in individual bad actors. It's really pervasive in our everyday lives, right? It's something that we can find in our everyday institutions and structures. So if we think of just one random example with technology, for example, many of us have an iPhone, right? And many of us talk to Siri, right? But often people say Siri is racist because Siri doesn't really understand everybody's accent, for example. So Siri is an example of a white listening subject, right? So the programmers of Siri never made her sort of sensitive or familiar to different types of accented Englishes. So because of that, Siri perceives different types of racialized speech as maybe not comprehensible, right? So she can't do her job, right? Because she wasn't programmed to do so. So Siri is sort of just a simple example of how we can see a white listening subject in a non-human. Okay. So yeah, the discussion about the white listening subject really highlights how racial linguistic ideologies are not solely about individual cognition, right? It's not about individual prejudice. It's really about something that's part of a social cognition, right? So embedded within our institutions and societal structures. So the reason why racial linguistic ideologies are very pervasive is because they're really products of colonial histories, right? In which the language of colonized peoples was deemed deficient, subhuman, and in need of formal remediation. And so these colonial assumptions remain in the belief that racialized people need to, quote, improve their languages or their language practices in order to survive in sites structured by white supremacy. Okay, and one such site is the workplace, which is my focus for today's presentation. But before I sort of talk about this sort of intersection of racial linguistic ideologies and work, I just want to go into a general discussion of language and work in late capitalism, which will kind of provide us with more background information on what I'm going to talk about later. So basically, given the prevalence of knowledge and service-based industries in the late capitalist economy, language is really a major component of work. So let's just take, for example, oral language, right? So if you're a fast food worker, for example, oftentimes you need to learn this scripted language in order to sort of interact with customers, right? So this scripted language is really about efficiency, like try to get the customer's order as quickly as possible, make sure the customer receives their order as quickly as possible. So for the fast food worker, mastering language is really mastering this scripted language. Something more complex might be in a courtroom, for example, a defense lawyer needing to defend their client. So the defense lawyer needs to improve their language skills in terms of maybe their storytelling ability, in terms of their argumentation strategies, their rhetorical skills, right? So it's a little bit more complex language skills that are required, right, in order to find maybe their client's not guilty, right? So that's what they're trying to do. So if language is a workplace skill, then the automatic assumption is that it's something that's learnable, right? And if it's something that's learnable, it's something that can be eventually mastered given the right amount of practice. But this idea of language as skill is often conflicts with earlier notions of language, right? Particularly the idea that language is identity, right? And so that's talked a lot about by Monica Heller and colleagues, so I encourage you to look at that work if you want more explanation about that point. But basically, this conflict between language as language as skill and language as identity is really seen like in the following. So even if workers acquire a language for work, particular social markers such as race can affect perceptions of how well they can use the language. So this goes back to racial linguistic ideologies and work, right? So if racial linguistic ideologies position the language practices of racialized people as naturally deficient, if these racialized people find work, right, they're going to be subject to these racial linguistic ideologies and be perceived as sort of these deficient language workers. And so This point is especially seen in one of the most studied areas of language work in late capitalism, which is transnational call centers in India. And this will sort of answer Rhonda's question from before. So just the thing to remember about India is that it remains an attractive site for transnational call center work for three main reasons. So first, it has a large English-speaking workforce, which is due to the legacy of British colonialism. It's something, this workforce is highly skilled in terms of their educational backgrounds. And of course, for multinational corporations, and perhaps the most important point, they're an inexpensive workforce. So Indian workers are cheap, highly skilled, English-speaking labor. So despite these positive qualities, it's often the case that the English skills of Indians are perceived as naturally flawed, right? And this is something that's perpetuated by even Indian companies themselves, right? So this can be explained by the colonial history of English, once again, and the neo-colonial relations between Western callers and agents. So if we think about the concept of Indian English, for example, when we juxtapose that with maybe pure varieties of English, maybe like Canadian English or British English, Indian English is perceived as corrupted, right? Because it's influenced by all of these indigenous Indian languages in terms of maybe vocabulary, phonology, etc. And so this deficit view of Indian English gets exacerbated in these sort of neo-colonial relations between Western callers and agents, in the sense that agents are really there to be subservient to the needs of Western callers, right? So when the callers phone, they expect the agents to help them as quickly as possible. But part of this sort of relationship is, of this subservience, is that Indian agents really need to orally match the linguistic repertoire of this Western caller, who's often imagined to be a white person. So when we think about call center work from a raciolinguistic perspective, the whitelisting subject really manifests in the workplace learning of Indian agents. And so, this goes back to Rana's question. So even Indian people, Indian trainers will correct the Indian quality of their fellow Indian speech, right? So this is, once again, not due to these individual racist Indians, right? It's because they're sort of adopting these racial linguistic ideologies that come from this legacy of British colonialism. So basically, when we see the whitelisting subject in the workplace learning of Indian agents, we see it in these sort of infamous accent neutralization courses. So they have to sound completely non-Indian to the Western caller in order to fool them to believe that they're talking to someone maybe in Canada or in the US, for example. We also see it in culture training as well. So Indians are often interpolated to believe that their local cultural norms or rules of etiquette are inappropriate when talking with Western callers. So they have to learn to sort of adopt another type of cultural etiquette when interacting with callers for call center work. Okay. So basically, racial linguistic ideologies don't solely emerge in workplace training, which I've just discussed with call center work. They're also, I think, very influential in the formation of labor markets. And I think one particular field where we can see this is English language teaching, or ELT for short. So basically, although ELT likes to promote itself as a neutral service meant to help people communicate in the globalized economy, it's nevertheless a profession that upholds so-called racial linguistic hierarchies. So how does it do this? So the first thing to remember is that ELT upholds, quote, nativeness as the professional standard for the field. So basically, if you're a learner of English, if you're a teacher of English, your linguistic model is the so-called native speaker of English, who's perceived to be the ideal user of the language. However, given the role of British colonialism, once again, in the global spread of English in places like India, etc., this sort of preference for nativeness can often be a proxy for an implicit preference for whiteness, for white bodies, right? So a native English speaker is imagined as a white person. And so this sort of colonial aspect of English language teaching really gets perpetuated in the present day with this notion of native speaker saviorism. And so this is a term coined recently by Christopher Jenks and Jerry Lee. And so they argue that ELT perpetuates a so-called native speaker saviorism, which is, quote, the long-standing assumption that the white community can, quote, save peoples of color by teaching them English, right? So it's basically this idea, right, if I'm a racialized learner of English, the only way that I can master the language is if I have the guidance of an expert white native speaker of English. Okay? So this idea of native speaker saviorism actually creates a market demand for white teachers, right, who are believed to embody natural expertise in the English language. And so this then creates the following raciolinguistic ideology. Since white teachers embody nativeness or expertise in the English language, their racialized counterparts represent the opposite and are thus deficient. So we really see this sort of simplified formula. If you're white, you're considered native, you're considered expert user of English. If you're non-white, you're considered non-native, you're considered a non-expert user of English. So we really see this sort of simplistic binary create a white listening subject in the ELT industry. And this white listening subject really frequently appears in the form of racist recruitment practices, which are either implicit or explicit, right? And so they basically target white job candidates. So sometimes you'll see schools advertise that they want white teachers only, or they want Caucasian teachers with so-called native accents. Sometimes these recruitment practices are a little bit more implicit in the sense that they might say, oh, we only want teachers from these so-called stereotypically white countries. So if you have a passport from Canada, the US, or the UK, right, it's easier for you to find work in countries like South Korea, for example. Okay. So basically this racist recruitment that happens in the ELT field was often experienced by the participants in my previous research that I did. And this research looked at the professional experiences of racialized English language teachers working in various private language schools in Toronto. So even though the teachers did manage to find work as teachers, right, in Toronto, they often had to contend with the white listening subject during their job hunts. And so in particular, many of them came to understand how employability was really something that they needed to racially embody, right? It wasn't something that they could simply display through their CV or their teaching portfolio or doing some sort of teaching demonstration, right? So it's something that they had to visually present in the labor market. Okay. So the typical way that they experience employability as a racially embodied concept was sort of through this frustration of not being able to prove their so-called nativeness to employers. So one example is seen in this story from Josh. So Josh is a mixed race teacher. Because he was born and raised in Canada, he identifies as a so-called native speaker of Canadian English, and he believes he speaks with a so-called native Canadian accent, right? So despite having the linguistic qualities, right, the desired linguistic qualities to be an English language teacher, Josh often felt that his racial background really prevented him from finding work easily. And so this is exemplified in this story that we have here. So Josh says, the employer asked, where did you do your studies? And I replied, here in Toronto. She went in anywhere else, I replied. No, she then asked. Sorry, I replied no. She then asked, what language do you speak at home? And I said, at home I speak English. She then asked, and your parents? They speak about 6 or 7 different languages all mixed up, I replied. But I can't speak those languages, I can only speak English. And after that she went, but when you communicate with them, how does that work? I said they have jobs in Canada, they understand English perfectly. And then she said, okay, but we're really looking for a native speaker. And I said, that's fine because I am a native speaker. So just as I said that, a white woman came out with a Scottish accent, and I thought, gee, she's not a native speaker because her first language may be Gaelic or Scots, for example, and she's working here. So I didn't know what to take from it, but they never called me back. So yeah, so it's a frustrating story on the part of Josh, right? But if we think about the white listening subject in the story, we really see it near the end, where Josh notices the white Scottish woman, right? So even though the Scottish woman might not have the desired linguistic background to be an English language teacher, for Josh at least, it seems that her embodied whiteness makes her somewhat employable, or more employable than Josh, right? Who has the desired linguistic background because he identifies as a native speaker, but he doesn't look like a native speaker, right? So this is where he experiences the white listening subject in this particular story. But it's important to remember that employability is not something that's scrutinized solely in the job interview process. It was something that the teachers experienced even after they found a job, right? And this is exemplified in a story by Yoon. So Yoon identifies as ethnically Chinese, and she identifies as a near native speaker of English because even though English is not her first language, she's the most proficient in that language, and she feels she has acquired a so-called native Canadian accent. So in this story, her employer kind of insinuates that because she is non-white, she has some sort of accent. That's a problem. So she says in the story, my Saudi students have a cultural bureau that sponsors them. So the bureau apparently called their students up and asked if any of our teachers at transnational school had an accent. So accent here might mean foreign accent. My boss told this to me and seemed to imply that they were asking about me. I was like, do I have an accent? And he replied, no, I don't think you have an accent, blah, 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 blah. But in my head, I'm like, why are you bringing this up to me? Like he brought it up not only once, but 2 or 3 times after that, which made it more hurtful for me. So if we return to this notion of the white listening subject once again, we really see it in how the employer had to repeatedly mention this problem with the Saudi bureau, right? So even though he openly proclaimed that Yoon did not have a so-called foreign accent, right? The fact that he brought it up multiple times seemed to insinuate, okay, well, Yoon, because you look this particular way, right? You're going to have a hard time you're going to have a hard time convincing people that you are a native speaker because of your racial background. Okay. So the thing about employability is it's something that's not only questioned by employers, it's also something that's questioned by the customer, by the students, right? And this is particularly seen by everyday doubts about racialized teachers' overall linguistic competence. And this is exemplified by a story from Maria. So Maria is originally from Brazil. She identifies as ethnically Japanese. She identifies as a so-called non-native speaker of English. So Maria is very proud of her grammatical knowledge of English, right? So she spent many years learning English. She spent many years teaching English. So she feels very confident in her grammatical knowledge of English. Despite this, however, she often noted how students seem to distrust her grammatical explanations, which we see in this story here. So Maria says, I was teaching the present perfect and if you could use it with today or not. I told my students that you could, depending on the time of the day you were using it. One student actually checked with another teacher who was actually a non-native teacher as well. She was white, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. She told the student that you can never use today with the present perfect. So the student actually went further and searched it, and he came back to me like 2 days later and said, you know what, you were white. You were right. I was going to say you were white, sorry. Sorry. You were right. So it was actually quite interesting. So here we see the white listening subject once again with the student needing to shop around for an answer, right? So once he determined that Maria wasn't going to give him a satisfactory answer, he went to the next person who would naturally embody the right answer. So Maria's white colleague, who coincidentally was a non-native teacher as well. So even though the student did acknowledge that Maria was eventually right, it was kind of this long process, right? She had to wait a fairly long time before she was believed as a teacher, right? So the white listening subject never gives the racialized teacher the benefit of the doubt. Okay. So I'm going to switch to talking about raciolinguistic ideologies in the labor process and focus more on my doctoral research now. So while raciolinguistic ideologies form labor markets, which we've just seen with ELT, they also play an influential role in the actual doing of linguistic labor. And to exemplify this point, I really want to, I think it's worthwhile to look at the laboring practices of ITAs, or international teaching assistants. So basically, because their foreign accented English is thought to hinder their professional communication in North American universities, ITAs are obliged to so-called fix their accents. So it's basically this idea that the ITA accent is perceived as incomprehensible for so-called domestic students, and then the domestic students complain that they can't understand their ITA and they can't learn effectively. And so this creates, so then they complain to administrators. Then administrators require the ITAs to kind of undergo sort of remedial language training in order to fix their accent or language in general. But for me in particular, I think that this idea of fixing an accent is not a straightforward process, especially when we think about the everyday workplace realities of ITAs. So the first thing to remember is that ITAs are working in internationalizing universities. So this means that they're not only interacting with these so-called domestic native English-speaking students, they're also interacting with fellow international students of various ethno-racial and linguistic backgrounds. So when it comes to this idea of fixing an accent, it's not very straightforward. Does the ITA try to sound more like the domestic student? Do they try to sound more like the international student, right? So there's a lot of nuance that they have to balance. The other thing to remember about ITA's workplaces is that they're often working in various academic disciplines, and these academic disciplines have their own communicative norms and cultures. So if we think about the social sciences and humanities, for example, or education, for example, there's a lot more emphasis on extended oral communication. And because of this emphasis, there might be more of an emphasis on having the right type of accent. In contrast, if we think about STEM fields like maybe engineering, the emphasis on oral communication is not that great. So if there's sort of this emphasis on minimal communication, is it really necessary to really focus on this minute thing as an accent, right? So really operating on this sort of complex premise, my doctoral research examined how 14 ITAs here in Ontario, I forgot, I'm in another province, okay, conceptualized and executed an accent for work. So basically I wanted to know what type of accent the ITAs perceived as satisfactory for doing the work, and then the extent to which they enacted their perceptions through their actual workplace practices. So during the Q&A sessions, I can talk about more about the findings from my research, because they're interesting and complex. But just in terms of this presentation right now, an important recurring finding was that was how the ITAs, as racialized speaking subjects, often drew on raciolinguistic ideologies in their descriptions of their laboring practices. Okay. So the primary way that they did this was kind of adopt this so-called white listening subject position with regard to evaluations of their own accents. And this is particularly seen by an ITA named Johnny. So Johnny is ethnically Chinese. He identifies as a so-called non-native speaker of English. So much of my discussions with Johnny pertain to him telling me about how he sort of linguistically prepares to conduct his tutorials. And part of this discussion was him sort of describing his so-called problems with his English pronunciation or accent in general. But when I was listening to him speak, I often thought that his problems were really not a big issue at all, right? And so this is kind of seen in this excerpt that we have here. So I'll read it and then I'll explain why I think Johnny is kind of unreasonable in his interpretations of his own speech. So he says, "I think we Chinese speakers can't speak think, the TH sound. We have some problems with that. My tutor tells me that my pronunciation is not good. For example, yesterday, when I first said yesterday, she said my pronunciation was not correct. She told me that I was missing the syllable in the middle. So I should say yesterday." Okay. So for me, at least, I think Johnny's perceptions are unreasonable because when you come to think of it, these problems can occur with so-called privileged white speakers. They can also occur in so-called privileged white-coded speech. So if we think about the TH sound, the theta sound, for example, it's interesting. I also had a white French-speaking TA, and he talked about having the same problem. But when he talked about it as sort of this unique quirk of his. So people thought it was cute and endearing that he couldn't pronounce the TH. So it was really not a professional obstacle for him. So when we think about this white French TA, and then we think about this Chinese speaker, Johnny, right? Johnny is really subject to this raciolinguistic ideology of Chinese people, in particular, being poor speakers of English, right? And so if they're perceived as always poor speakers of English, every little pronunciation problem of theirs is going to be perceived as this major error, right? So even though Johnny and the French TA are making the same sort of error, right? Johnny is sort of more obliged to change it, right? As opposed to the French TA. The thing about yesterday too, who pronounces the second syllable in yesterday fully? I don't think many of us really pronounce the full. You could if you want, right? But yesterday, you could if you're speaking very slowly, but when we're talking in a normal rate of speech, or I'm probably talking too fast now, but if talking in a quicker rate of speech, right, you just say yesterday, yesterday. So the ter is really just this unstressed schwa sound, right, most of the time. And this, we can see this in like so-called Canadian English, British English, etc. So why can't Chinese English speakers do the same thing, right? So it's sort of an unreasonable expectation for the tutor to tell him, oh, change your pronunciation of yesterday, right? It's sort of not necessary. Okay. So this white listening subject position can also be reflected in the actual professional practices or the communicative practices of the ITAs. And this was also exemplified by Johnny once again. So in this brief story that we have here, Johnny was talking about how he uses gesture to communicate with students. So he says, there was a final examination today, so not much communication between me and the students. One thing that happened was that a student wore a baseball cap, and according to the exam guide, students can only wear a baseball cap backwards. So I told him, please reverse your hat, but the student did not understand me. I think he was a white native Canadian. So I had to gesture, reversing the hat to let him know. Okay, so with this story, at first glance, it seems like a positive story, right? So Johnny is showcasing the full range of his communicative repertoire, right? So if people can't understand his spoken utterances, right, he can just use nonverbal actions to successfully make his point, right? So it's a happy story on the surface. But I want to be pessimistic. I know it's bad to be pessimistic sometimes, but amidst this positivity, we have to consider how Johnny's nonverbal actions was really him needing to bypass these racial-linguistic ideologies that are directed toward him. So I want to pay attention to this last sentence. Oh, that's a sensitive screen. Okay. The last sentence, I had to gesture. So Johnny never said I wanted to gesture. He never said I gestured. He used that modal verb of obligation. I had to gesture. And this is strange for me because if we look more at the beginning of the story, once the student didn't understand him, right, Johnny immediately went to gesture. He didn't try to repeat himself. So this is sort of, for me at least, my understanding of Johnny, understanding that his speech is naturally not comprehensible, and so he makes that assumption right away without trying to repeat himself. So he has to do something that sort of adheres to these racial linguistic ideologies by not speaking at all, right, by using a nonverbal action. So we really have to think about how Johnny's communicative agency is really reproducing racial linguistic ideologies at the micro level. Yeah, so even though the ITAs talked a lot about being interpolated by racial linguistic ideologies, they could also showcase that the white listening subject could be disrupted in particular workplace contexts. And this was particularly seen with an ITA named Adela, and Adela worked in an engineering department. So with engineering and accent, it's important to remember that engineering is one of those fields which is dominated by international students, right? So that means in terms of accent, if everyone is a so-called non-native speaker of English, is it really necessary to change or nativize your accent, right? If everyone is speaking in a variety of manners of English. And also with engineering, like I mentioned before, it's one of those fields where oral communication is not highly valued. If you need to speak, you better speak quickly and concisely, right? So once again, is the accent change really important in this context? So these points are kind of exemplified in Adela's narrative here, and it's about a prof that she had from East Asia. So she says, I've had professors from East Asia who didn't have a native accent or close to a native accent, but their English was clear, I could understand them. For example, we took this robotics course with an Asian prof. He didn't have a native accent, but I felt that the way he delivered and structured the course and his pronunciation was very clear. So we never had any issues. Okay, so once again, on the surface, I feel this is a positive story. So Adela is showcasing that she doesn't have to listen. She can ignore racial linguistic ideologies by acknowledging that an East Asian professor with a non-native accent can be heard as understandable and an effective teacher. But my pessimistic self would ask, by sort of disrupting racial linguistic ideologies in this case, is Adela relying on another set of ideologies to do so? So to sort of argue this point, I want to pay attention to how workplace context actually interacts with racial identity. So as we know, Adela's prof is East Asian, right? And so in the North American context, we have this narrative of East Asians, or Asians in general, being naturally gifted in robotics and these other STEM fields, right? So since Adela's prof sort of stereotypically embodies this expertise in in robotics, perhaps Adela and other interlocutors might be more forgiving about his accents, because implicitly they know, okay, he's Asian, he must know math and robotics and everything, so I can give him the benefit of the doubt with regard to his accent and learn to accommodate his accent. So yeah, in one sense, Adela is sort of disrupting racial-linguistic ideologies, but she's also relying on the stereotype of Asians as excelling in these STEM fields. Okay. Okay, so I'm almost done talking. So the last part of my presentation is really just looking at how we can further explore racial-linguistic ideologies at work. So as seen with ELT and ITs, racial-linguistic ideologies can manifest in various contexts where language is the prime aspect of working life. So in terms of future research, I think it would be interesting to examine how the white listening subject influences the different purposes of language in the workplace. So what we saw with ELT was the white listening subject being concerned with this notion of nativeness, non-nativeness. In the context of IT's work, it's really about this distinction between, well, also between nativeness, non-nativeness, but also specifically about intelligibility and lack of intelligibility. In different workplace contexts where there are different focuses on language, we could maybe ask if the white listening subject influences the notion of trustworthiness in the context of advertising. So advertising is one of those fields where our linguistic practices are supposed to make ourselves sort of credible, believable for the customer to buy some sort of product, right? So is it possible that the language practices of racialized people are perceived as less trustworthy than those of white people, for example? So there's some literature on this, not in the field of racial linguistic ideologies, but sort of these sort of critical advertising studies, if you want to call it that. We can also look at the white listening subject in the context of phone sex work. So does the white listening subject perceive particular racialized voices as either sexually appealing or not sexually appealing? So that's another example. So as briefly highlighted with Adela's narrative, it's important to consider how workplace context has the potential to disrupt racial linguistic ideologies. And so if this is the case, then it's really important to note whether another set of oppressive ideologies is needed to do so. So a lot of my recent reading is about accent and work, and what I notice is that a stigmatized accent in one workplace context is sort of destigmatized in another workplace context. So if we think about an Indian accent, once again, in call center work is perceived as incomprehensible. But if you put that Indian accent in an Indian restaurant, then it gets perceived as a marker of authenticity, right? It adds to the service encounter of being in an Indian restaurant. But in that case, the Indian restaurant example is sort of perpetuating this notion of authenticity, right? And authenticity is really this sort of racialized and nativist concept to begin with. So it's another set of problematic ideologies that we have to adhere to if we want to disrupt the racial linguistic ideology in that context. So we have to be careful. Okay. So when we study racial linguistic ideologies, I think the purpose is not to simply show that they exist, right? It's not some sort of fun, new, exciting, interesting research topic, right? If we want to study racial linguistic ideologies in the workplace, we really have to be focused on combating them in the workplace and beyond. And so when we think about dismantling racial linguistic ideologies, I always remember this point from Nelson Flores. So he keeps a blog called The Educational Linguist. And so it's basically him sort of translating his academic work into more accessible writing for a practitioner audience. So I really encourage you to read it because it's a nice, simple way that he sort of makes the same arguments in his scholarly work. But anyway, one of his blog entries was called Racial Linguistic Ideologies Are Not Individual Thoughts, They're Structural Racism. So this goes back to my previous point about racial linguistic ideologies not being about individual prejudice. It's really about this thing that's embedded within our institutions and structures. So if we're fighting against these racial linguistic ideologies, it's not about changing individual hearts and minds, right? I'm not trying to while we're not trying to make everyone reach an epiphany, right, it's really about dismantling the systems of white supremacy that create the white perceiving subject in the first place. So we really have to think about structural change rather than individual change. However, that's easier said than done, and so that's something that's another research topic or presentation topic to talk about. But when we think about racial-linguistic ideologies in the context of the workplace, perhaps one way that we can sort of fight against them, at least on the micro level, is to reimagine workplace training. So oftentimes we think of workplace training as kind of this apolitical, technical thing that we have to do. Oh, we do this mandatory safety drill, or we have to do this sort of computer course, whatever. Why can't we use these opportunities also to talk about anti-oppression or talk about these ideologies of oppression? Why can't these be sites where we do these things? So one example of how I'm trying to do that in the context of my work with ITs is trying to really conceptualize this thing called anti-racist pronunciation teaching. So I really haven't thought about it coherently. This is something I'm still playing around with. I did a presentation earlier this month about it, but it's not something that's coherently articulated as of yet. But basically for me, this type of teaching doesn't treat pronunciation as a technical skill. Rather, it interrogates how accent or pronunciation in general really acts as a site for ideational material racism, and it also seeks to combat this racial linguistic arrangement, right? So it's really looking at how pronunciation is not really something that can be decontextualized. It's always, when we pronounce a word, when we speak with an accent, it's always within a social context and what sort of power structures are at play in particular social contexts. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, and hopefully I'll figure it out soon. Okay. Yes, I didn't include the reference list in the slides because there are too many, but if you're interested in the reference list, feel free to email me at that email address. Yeah, if you're on Twitter and you'd like to hear more about my thoughts about language, race, and work, you can follow me at that Twitter handle. So I like to talk about accent and criticize accent reduction a lot. So if you like those types of things, you can follow me. If not, don't follow me. You'll be disappointed. Yeah, and I felt bad that I didn't incorporate any plurilingualism for the Plurilingual Lab speaker series. So the last slide is my superficial attempt to display some sort of plurilingual competence. So thank you in different linguistic repertoires. So merci, grazie. I think that's 감사합니다. Arigato gozaimasu. Muito obrigado. Muchísimas gracias, etc. Okay, thank you.